I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we've got a great show for you today. We've got fairly breaking news out of South Dakota. Kristi Noem appears to capitulate to the Chamber of Commerce, Amazon, and woke capital. We're going to talk about the lie of you can have it all feminism. And then finally, we're going to close with a segment on America's enemies showing a lack of respect. So to kick us off here, let's start with the breaking news. So Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on in South Dakota with Governor Kristi Noem?
Yeah, so we are recording this on Monday, and Governor Noem actually just wrapped a press conference in which she's discussing how she's going to handle a bill that the South Dakota legislature sent to her late last week. And the bill effectively protects, biological women in girls' sports. It restricts, women's sports to biological females and does a couple of other things about performance enhancing drugs and, making sure that no one can be discriminated against for reporting, if their school is not complying. Now, up until this point, Governor Noem was pretty enthusiastic about the legislation. She had tweeted out she was prepared to sign it. She was behind this bill. And, South Dakota is not acting in a vacuum. 28 other states have legislation similar to what South Dakota just passed. I think 2 states have actually passed similar legislation. So all was smooth sailing, apparently, until the corporate interests got a hold of Governor Noem. So, apparently she had been meeting with a number of groups that didn't want this legislation to pass, among them the Sioux Falls Chamber of Commerce, which was concerned that an Amazon distribution facility would not come to Sioux Falls as planned if this legislation were to pass. And this is a playbook we've seen from corporate America, time and time again. Of course, movie companies won't film in Georgia because they pass pro-life legislation, but, meanwhile have no problem filming in places like Tunisia where, gay marriage is banned and people are stoned. So the double standard is pretty clear. But Governor Noem effectively did what's called a style and form veto. So the bill came to her desk and she didn't veto it outright. She said, no, in fact, I'll sign this bill if you include my changes. But unfortunately, her changes gut 2 pretty big sections of the bill. The first is around performance enhancing drugs. She did not like a requirement every year for parents to certify that their children are not taking performance enhancing drugs, said it was too much of a compliance burden. I would just point out there's a number of compliance burdens similar to this that schools already deal with. But the second change, and what was really the big one, was she wanted struck an entire section of the bill that would have limited to biological women, girls' sports at the elementary, secondary, and collegiate level. Now, she wanted the collegiate level struck. And effectively, this is the NCAA's argument, right? NCAA said, came in and apparently exerted a substantial amount of pressure on her. But it's worth pointing out that the NCAA itself does not ban schools from treating men as men and women as women. It does not require them to allow men transitioning to women to play in their sports. Otherwise, any number of religious schools would be banned from playing in the NCAA, and we know that that's not the case. What it does say is that it permits men who are transitioning into women, if they've been on a years-long, testosterone suppressing regimen, they can compete, but schools are not required to allow them. So the argument from Kristi Noem is kind of specious in that regard. Also worth pointing out that Idaho passed similar legislation about their own collegiate sports, I think a year ago, and the NCAA, while, hand-wringing and issuing a press release, has not barred them from competing or somehow punished the state. So it's actually worth pointing out what Governor Noem did announce was a coalition. Guys, you can sign a petition about protecting Title IX. I hope you feel relieved that Kristi Noem is standing up for your rights with a petition. So, it's really a remarkable episode for a couple of reasons. One is for political reasons. Kristi Noem was seen as a rising star within the Republican Party, on the short list for 2024, had a lot of, excitement around her. And I think she effectively just gutted her political career. Because again, we are in an era where the Republican base wants to see strong leadership, wants to see people willing to take on, vested interests that's, are against the traditional way of life. And she had a silver platter on which to make this stand. And she completely reversed herself. So not only is she, capitulating, I think, to these woke interests, she reversed herself right? She said she was very clearly going to sign this bill, and then she, did the opposite. So I think politically that she's going to take some major hits. But, I think more broadly, this speaks to the fact that, a reoccurring theme on this show, which is, the Republican Party at large, I think, is still deferring very much to corporate interests, and those corporate interests hate traditional conservatives. They really do not like and have no interest in dealing with, the traditional ways of life, religious conservatives. And, the battle for the Republican Party is finding politicians that are willing to stand up to that. And I think, Governor Noem had her chance and swing and a miss. So we're back to square one with her, I suppose. So I'll open it up there if anyone has anything to add to my summary.
Well, I was just going to say, as generally pessimistic as I am, I see a blinding silver lining in everything Rachel just laid out, because Kristi Noem flipped, then flopped, and now she's starting to flip back and trying to have her cake and eat it too. And I think it's because she came under immense pressure from the party and from, I shouldn't say the party, but from the conservative movement. And she actually is reacting to pressure from the conservative movement, which is not something that used to really happen in the Republican Party. And so I think it's a really positive sign that Kristi Noem feels like she's under immense pressure right now to do something, and that like people really saw. This is very different than what happened with Pat McCrory and what happened with Mike Pence as governors when they were in battles with, say, the NCAA over restroom legislation or whatever it was, locker room legislation. This is very, very different. What we've seen is pretty much a full-throated condemnation of Kristi Noem. Nobody's pulling punches from the conservative movement, and we've seen her feel the squeeze of that enough that she came out with a press conference this morning to sort of do damage control. So the fact that a Republican governor feels as though they have to do damage control because the pressure from the conservative movement was so uniform and full-throated and enthusiastic, I feel is really a silver lining to this entire situation, which is hurting girls in South Dakota. Absolutely, no question about it, if she doesn't pursue this. What's funny to me is that somebody like Kristi Noem should actually be prioritizing legislation like this for political and for moral reasons. She shouldn't be cowering away from this. Should be something for political reasons, like we saw with Kelly Loeffler in Georgia. Kelly Loeffler, an establishment Republican in Georgia, was running ads on girls' sports in a tightly contested race. That was a huge sign of how things have changed, particularly in the Trump era and particularly with culture war issues. And when people like Kristi Noem cede these battles for the sake of temporarily pleasing Amazon or the Chamber of Commerce or whatever it is, you are ceding the assertion or the contention behind their argument about biological sex. And all of those small battles add up to death by 1,000 cuts. That's why it's so important to fight every single one of these, not just because there are girls that will be harmed if you don't, but because it sets the standard for our culture and for our society. It is not worth whatever Kristi Noem thinks she's getting from Amazon, which, as Rachel mentions, is holding her hostage to a total double standard. Amazon is implicated in selling goods from Uyghur labor. And they're complaining about South Dakota? I mean, it's outrageous. And there's so many reasons that Kristi Noem should have been eagerly leaning into this instead of leaning away from this. But even as the pessimist, as somebody who feels generally pessimistic about things, I see it as just such a silver lining that the conservative movement jumped on top of this right away, and uniformly as well.
So I think Emily hits the nail on the head here as far as the silver lining is concerned. I subscribe to my buddy John Schweppy's Substack. He's at the American Principles Project, and he's been kind of hammering this point over the past few days. And, I have to think that folks like John, who have been really kind of just drilling Governor Noem over this, have actually had an impact in getting back to the flip from the flop from the flip. And here we are at this point. But a couple of points that I want to make here. I think back after what happened on January 6th, and a lot of kind of Fortune 500 type donors started to separate themselves, not just from Senator Hawley, not just from Senator Cruz, but kind of from the Republican Party more generally. Saurabh Murray wrote an op-ed for the New York Post basically saying, good, like hasten the corporate divorce from the Republican Party. This is a good thing. These people hate us. There is no reason whatsoever other than kind of vestigial reasons that are no longer applicable in the year 2021 to kind of have this dangling alliance with the Chamber of Commerce types. So I wonder if the grassroots pushback that is getting Kristi Noem back to the flip from the flop will kind of only accelerate that divorce. And I think those of us on this podcast probably are hoping for that. There once was a time perhaps when the Republican Party was best served by aligning itself with Wall Street, Fortune 500. Those days at this point are just so very clearly over. We talk about woke capital every single time on this podcast is an issue that frankly never gets old. And a closely related point to that, from a pure kind of cynical, self-interested perspective, as Rachel and Emily have both alluded to, it just doesn't make any sense. This is a winning issue for conservatives. Preserving women's sports is a politically winning issue for conservatives. Opposing transgender radicalism on Title IX, on Title VII, on Title whatever, these are winning issues for conservatives. And we have to feel emboldened to speak up on them and to stand for the rudimentary biological fact that XY chromosomes are different than XX chromosomes. You cannot change this. This is human nature. If we can't defend that, if we can't stand on these grounds, what on earth can we possibly stand on? So it doesn't make sense for any of these reasons. But the Chamber of Commerce agenda, kind of the open borders amnesty agenda, the Chamber of Commerce has always supported those sorts of initiatives. That is not popular with the grassroots. And it should be troubling, certainly, if someone like Kristi Noem, who is in South Dakota, for God's sake, okay? This is not Texas. This is not Florida. This is not kind of like a major, iconic, highly populous red state with a city like Houston or Dallas or Miami. But this is a true kind of flyover country red state here. So if it's happening there, it could happen anywhere. I just hope what I said earlier is true, that this does kind of hasten and accelerate the corporate divorce from the Republican Party.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think it's a good thing when we have litmus test issues such as these exposed. And this wasn't really like a 50-50 coin flip kind of issue. It was clear that the vast majority of the public was on one side, and the politician in this case sided with the small minority, powerful minority at that, but nevertheless the small one. So it's disappointing on one level, but on another level, I think it also underscores something that we ought to emphasize, which is that why did the governor feel that this small minority, woke capital, Amazon, with no allegiance to her state, basically, was so powerful that it merited this sort of style and form response, as it was described in terms of her veto, which itself sort of demonstrates how much she was waffling internally in her own mind in this situation, she being Governor Noem. But it speaks to the fact, why isn't our side organized? We have majority numbers on any number of issues, but the other side often finds a way to win, even when they're outnumbered, because they know how to organize, they know how to create coalitions, exert power, and impose their will ultimately. I analogize it sort of to the school shutdowns. And parents across this country should be the largest and most powerful constituency by far in the issue, but the teachers' unions frequently roll over the public. The shutdown should have broken teachers' unions, and where was our side on that matter? The rhetoric is there, but the political power isn't there. So to go back to a running theme here, if we have the right ideas, and we have ideas that are in the majority across the country, we need to be able to actually take that power, coalesce it, and use it to serve our ends at the end of the day. And that's the charge for all of us and our audience and beyond in this country to figure out.
So, look, woke capital, obviously a huge problem that we come back to over and over again, the problems of the Chamber of Commerce agenda and how it is at odds with what conservative voters want. Let's kick it over to Emily. Why don't you tell us about what time it is, so to speak, in third wave modern feminism?
Well, it's a time when I think our cultural norms and institutions are crumbling and are increasingly untethered from where they need to be and from a shared set of values. And what we're actually going to talk about right now is a tweet that went super viral. And we'll get a visual up on the screen for you. It was from Michael Foster. It was sent on March 19th. It had a picture of a Bloomberg Businessweek cover, and it said, "Freeze your eggs, free your career." And that was a profile a few years back of a woman who did exactly what was on that cover. Now, there was a Washington Post headline, exactly as the cover said. There was a Washington Post line a couple of years after that that said, "Cruel twist of fate for single woman who froze her eggs in her 30s to, quote, free her career." It cost her $19,000 and it didn't work. And it's extremely sad. And the news value of this is that There's a Financial Times article actually from not that long ago, over the course of the pandemic, earlier in March, about how women are leaving the workforce in higher numbers due to the pandemic. And there's a question now of whether this is a good thing or whether this is a bad thing. And that's a question about women's preferences. And to return to the question that is the umbrella over this entire debate, can women have it all? And that was a hot topic, in that sort of second term of Barack Obama's administration. Can women have it all? It really depends on your definition of all. And we no longer have a shared definition of what it means to have it all. We have Bloomberg Businessweek trumpeting a woman whose version of having it all is spending $20,000 to preserve her natural ability so that she can have a high-powered career, and then having that process that cost her so much money and cost her so much time and may have cost her fertility, having that process fail. This is a really, really remarkable thing to consider in the context of the pandemic, when that Financial Times article, for instance, is talking about how women are leaving the workforce at a higher proportion, when we're sort of almost at the sunset, it feels like, of the pandemic. And now you have a lot of women who might be looking around and saying, well, gosh, the men in my office are ahead of me, but I've had all of this extra time with my children. So this raises a lot of interesting questions, and I'm curious to just sort of get your guys' feedback on the tweet itself, how it started versus how it's going. That was sent and went very viral last week in the context of this conversation about the pandemic.
Well, it was interesting, the response to how that tweet was framed, because so many people were like, well, this is so cruel. Like, why would you, mock this woman? And I didn't take it that way. I mean, it's a cruel process. And I think it's a cruel notion to sell to women this idea that there is a silver bullet that they can, delay their fertility to have a career and then just pick up right where they left off, and there's going to be no cost and no consequence. But that's the lie that I think societies, or certain segments of society, have been selling women this entire time. And I think being able to talk honestly about those trade-offs is something that we just hasn't been tolerated, I think, culturally. And I think maybe the pandemic is making that conversation change a little bit, because to your point about sort of the Obama years, that was the era of the lean in feminism, right? This Sheryl Sandberg goes like, just lean in and, it'll be fine. And like, marry someone good. Basically, that was like the totality of lean in, if anyone ever read it. And, yeah, right. And I just think that, it's borne out. It's interesting. It's kind of loops back around to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about this debate among conservatives, like, should we help the family, via economic policy? Because, based on a survey American Compass did, more women would prefer to actually stay home when their children are young if they had the financial means. But, I think post-sexual revolution, and Christopher Caldwell writes very eloquently about this as well. We've pushed women into the workforce and sold them this notion that, the lifestyle you want has to be 2 income supported. And also it's fine because you can just delay your fertility and pick up, where you left off. And I just think that isn't true. That isn't true anymore. And I think for conservatives, especially, we've always shied away from this issue as well. We've said, well, personal choice is what we prioritize. And so whatever women decide is fine. And now we're saying, look, actually, if we do want strong families and we do want to be a party that responds to preferences, how should our policy be reoriented to make sure that, the realities of fertility are being discussed, right? That you can't, there's a time clock on these things, and that's just reality. Science can't overcome that. And so I think, the posture of the conversation is now changing, at least on the right. I don't think the left will ever acknowledge anything about what I just said. They're still very much in the egg freezing is good question. So.
Can I just jump in also with some details here from the Financial Times article? There's a quote that's used as a header in the article. My ability to participate in the workplace has gone back to the 1950s. And that's used, again, as a header. More than 70% of mothers said in the Financial Times survey that they felt it was expected that extra household duties would fall on them. A similar proportion of women report hardly managing more than 1 hour of uninterrupted work, 24 percentage points more than men. So it's basically just that as schools were closed, women are bearing the burden of housework, according to this survey, more than men are. And then that's also, hurting them in the workforce. So I'll kick it over. I just wanted to add those details because I think they're another interesting context, particularly that header about the 1950s.
Josh, you want to jump in, or do you want me to take it?
Please, men.
I will proud. Ben, I will proudly volunteer as the first male to jump into this conversation. Look, it was really interesting to see the reactions to this tweet. I had some similar thoughts to what Rachel said. I want to make a slightly different point here, actually. We talked about economics last week, actually. We had the whole 2 cheers versus 3 cheers debate. We've talked a lot about family policy and kind of the future of conservative economics in general. Look, I majored in economics in college. I was kind of like my profession before I went to law school, and I still follow like economics blogs to this day and all that stuff. One of the cardinal rules of economics is that every decision that you make, there is a trade-off. The traditional term that you hear about is opportunity cost, right? So, for example, like when I decided to go to law school at age 24, I was there 24 to 27 years old. My opportunity costs are the wages that I would have earned but for going to law school, and the career advancement that I would have had but for going to law school, et cetera. The point here is not about economic theory. The point here is that it is a fundamental, a fairly ironclad rule, I would say, of life. And we don't necessarily like talking about kind of universal rules. We talk more about generalizations, but it's probably about as close to an ironclad universal rule as you can have, that life has trade-offs. That by doing A, you might not have B, by doing X, you might not have Y. And I think to Rachel's point, we as a society have just gotten very scared to talk about that. And I kind of wonder why that might be. And I guess there's one possible kind of hypothetical. I'm kind of coming to this conclusion in real time here, so we'll see how it comes out. It seems to me that there's a kind of across the political spectrum, kind of a bipartisan kind of a utopianism that has taken place. We far too often, certainly on the right, what I would consider to be a probably like overly liberalized right, especially right in kind of the post-World War II kind of quote unquote modern conservative movement era, that is kind of, I think, overly motivated by kind of a liberal abstractions. There's a certain amount of utopianism embedded in there. Certainly on the left, we've seen in recent years the left kind of coming back to its frankly Marxist grassroots. That's kind of the whole point of Yoram Hazony's essay at Quillette last August about kind of the rise of this neo-Marxism. Marxism is nothing if not utopian. I mean, we would call it dystopian, but it is certainly based on a utopian premise. So I kind of wonder here if we as a society, if our fear of talking about the obvious trade-offs that happen in life, and in this particular context with women having careers and freezing eggs, there are obvious trade-offs. If our reticence, if our reluctance to talk about that is because at a level of politics, and probably also religion, by the way, religion plays into this as well. Theologically conservative strands of religion for both Judaism and Christianity are much more comfortable talking about kind of realism and trade-offs and things of that nature. I think when you kind of get to, theologically liberal Christianity, traditional mainline Protestantism, certainly in like Reform Judaism and things of that nature, you kind of hear a lot of kind of utopian abstractions. So as traditional religion has receded, as kind of utopianism and secularism has arisen, I wonder if we as a society have just gotten less and less comfortable talking about the obvious truism that in life there are any number of trade-offs.
All right, I'll second Josh's comment. That'd be my first point, writ large. I will say from my vantage point, this was a tragic story, and one that's probably going to be all too common going forward. I've seen among friends who I have, in their 30s, who, have certainly seen the propagation of the message of having it all and seen the downsides, the pitfalls to it of not forming a family at a relatively young age or at all, and how depressing that is for so many people. So, I guess one of the unintended consequences, or to stick with this sort of economics theme, is that a lot of people have been made miserable by the prevailing sort of official narrative about what constitutes having a happy and fulfilling life. And that's really tragic, and it actually has generational consequences ultimately, and we should freely and openly talk about them. There's also something worth examining as well, and this kind of gets to the policy question to some extent, is since women entered the workforce writ large, at the same time, over decades, we've seen the cost of living, the fact that you need 2 incomes essentially to survive in so many places, become the norm. And I think ultimately it further makes a lot of people miserable and stressed out that both parents need to be working full time all the time and managing a family at the same time, when domestic duties alone plus raising children is more than a full-time job. So why that happened and how that's happened is another economic question, but there are social reasons that lead to that economic question. And also, of course, policy implications. So I don't have a lot more to add than that, but I do think it's worth noting that where society has gone on these issues has led to consequences that have been really dark and dire and will be generational.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful insight. And with that, actually, Ben, we can move on over to your segment right now.
Well, to another dark and disturbing area, although not really so, a different area, let's say. I'm going to be talking a bit about what transpired just in the last week, which I'm going to argue in a forthcoming piece reflects the fact that the Biden administration is neither feared nor respected in the world. The Trump administration, the popular narrative about it was that he's essentially disliked, detested by many of our purported partners and allies. But at the end of the day, he achieved results. Obviously, the Abraham Accords taking on communist China to an unprecedented extent, reinvigorating the Quad. So for all of those on the left who talk about Trump being so anti-multilateralism, he reinvigorated the core alliance between Japan, Australia, America, and India to counter, in large part, communist China, and a host of other policies as well. The Biden administration has said America is back, which means multilateralism, deferring to international organizations and the like, seeking to return to the Iran nuclear deal, coming to the table with China to a different degree than the Trump administration did, and well beyond those matters. In the last week, the Biden administration has gotten hammered by all of our worst adversaries. And I'll chronicle some of what they said. First of all, at this highly anticipated meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, between Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and their Chinese Communist Party counterparts, the Biden administration, in sort of a diplomatic way, laid out its beef with the Chinese Communist Party, although they didn't frame it as such, with respect to their human rights violations and some economic coercion as well. And their Chinese Communist Party counterparts, and this was sort of unprecedented because the cameras were rolling in the room and it was assumed that there would just be some prepared remarks for a short period of time and then move on to the real meetings off camera. Chinese Communist Party counterparts slammed the Biden administration and did what every communist regime does, which was try to portray the US as hypocritical, and even through the left's own narratives back at the Biden administration. I'll quote here, CCP diplomat Yang Jiechi said, I quote, "On human rights, we hope that the United States will do better." And he added, "The challenges facing the United States in human rights are deep-seated," and quote, "They did not just emerge over the past 4 years, such as Black Lives Matter." So they stuck the knife in the Biden administration and then twisted it by using the same sort of 1619 Project style narrative and throwing it right back in the faces of these two top national security and foreign policy officials. On the eve of the meeting, China's ambassador to the US also trolled with the question, will the US be a responsible stakeholder in global affairs? Famously, Bob Zoellick back in 2005, who was one of the premier champions of engaging and integrating and accommodating the Chinese Communist Party, asked, will communist China be a responsible stakeholder? So of course, the Chinese have a pretty long memory here. They threw it right back in the face of the administration. And I've heard some China hawks out there say, well, look, you know what? The Biden administration got this unhinged sort of response out of their Chinese Communist Party counterparts, and they're really just playing to Xi Jinping, their one single core constituency. But I don't perceive it as such. We got slammed on our own soil using our own rhetoric from the perspective of the Biden administration. And that's an embarrassment. And that the Chinese Communist Party was so brazen and audacious to do so, I think really speaks volumes about what they think about the administration. And to top it off, the administration after the meeting, while expressing that they had their misgivings about what transpired, still said they wanted to engage with the Chinese Communist Party in areas of mutual interest, including the environment and energy, the pandemic, I believe, Afghanistan and beyond, and probably the Iran nuclear deal as well. So it was embarrassing from my perspective. But and that's on top of, by the way, as I've chronicled at length in several pieces, the administration's numerous efforts to ease the Trump administration's sort of analogous maximum pressure campaign to what they did with the Iranian regime as well. Okay, moving beyond China, Russia. Joe Biden apparently called President Vladimir Putin, a killer, and Putin came back with, quote, "It takes one to know one." He challenged the president to a streaming debate, and he added, without a hint of subtlety, quote, "I wish you, President Biden, health." I say that without any irony or joke. It's embarrassing that Vladimir Putin would respond that way. And the fact that he gets to the questions, of course, not subtly at all, of mental acuity and fitness of Joe Biden, that he tries to draw moral equivalence with him. It shows, again, that I think our adversaries believe the emperor has no clothes. Okay, let's move on to Iran now, where the Biden administration has done everything to bend over backwards to get back to the negotiating table desperately with Iran to reinvigorate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Okay, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif in Politico does an interview about the impasse and why Iran doesn't want to come to the table. And he says he declared that the US must, quote, "come back to compliance with the Iran nuclear deal before Iran will move on it. And Iran will not go an inch further than going back to a deal they were never really complying with in the first place." Again, laughing at the Biden administration. Last but not least, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the aforementioned Secretary Blinken went to Japan and South Korea to speak with our allies, rightfully so, on the eve of this China meeting, even though the administration was at pains to say that there's no linkage between this Asia trip and then the meeting with the Chinese Communist Party officials. So how did North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, respond to this? She, quote, warns the new US administration trying hard to give off powder smell in our land, unquote. And she says, if it wants to sleep in peace for coming 4 years, it had better refrain from causing a stink at its first step. This is after North Korea has not returned the calls, reportedly, of the Biden administration seeking to engage in diplomatic talks. So put this all together, the administration has been incredibly soft from a policy perspective on all of our worst adversaries. It uses some harsh rhetoric by Biden administration standards, and it gets it thrown right back in its face by all of our worst adversaries. Does anyone walk away from this thinking that our adversaries are lashing out because they're weak and they're scared of the Biden administration? I don't know how anyone could perceive it as such. And so what are the consequences of this? Well, as we've talked about before, appeasement only begets aggression. And consequently, we're seeing, I believe, what was clearly anticipated when you consider that this was the number 2 in the Obama-Biden administration, who's the president, and that he's brought back all of the Biden administration officials, essentially. We're seeing a reprisal of essentially an America Last policy. So I'm curious to know how others in the panel see what's transpired over the last week and what you think the consequences are. And I'll go to Josh first on that.
It just seems to me that, I mean, we've discussed this on the show in previous podcasts, to be clear, for sure. But the Trump administration, the entire point of the so-called America First agenda, and America First obviously was kind of a sweeping term that, you know, meant everything from kind of the proverbial quote unquote trade war with China to foreign policy in itself. But especially as it pertains to kind of cracking down on China for the first time since Richard Nixon famously went to meet Chairman Mao, things like kind of realigning us towards Saudi Arabia and away from the Iranian regime. The whole point of the America First foreign policy doctrine, as kind of like Mike Anton explained it in that very famous Foreign Policy Magazine essay, was to bolster our allies and to undermine or hurt our enemies, otherwise known as common sense, otherwise known as what literally every rational actor on the global stage has done since the formation of the nation state. Heck, I mean, I'll go back even further than that. Since prior to the nation state, since we were clans or tribes, families, literally every family looks out for itself before it looks out for anyone else, and seeks to kind of bolster those to whom it is friendly and to undermine those to whom it is unfriendly. This is just common sense to the extent that something like this is embedded in our human nature. I mean, it's certainly close to that at a minimum. But anyway, I'm kind of those like abstract ramblings aside, at a more tangible level here, I just don't understand how how Democrats and liberals get over their just astounding hypocrisy on the Chinese Communist Party in particular. Leftists, liberals, the Samantha Power, Hillary Clinton responsibility to protect kind of liberal humanitarian brigade, they took us into war in Libya in 2011 to topple Gaddafi. Why? For no particularly kind of national interest, national security centric reason whatsoever, other than this kind of like vague notion that America has a moral obligation to protect human rights and humanitarian interests abroad. How the heck in the year 2021 does this wing of the movement, of the progressive movement, of the Democratic Party, to the extent it even exists anymore, the extent it hasn't been completely overtaken by intersectionality and whatnot. How does this wing of the party possibly rationalize wanting to open up and couple and link up more with a Chinese Communist Party that is committing what officials of both parties have now described under the Geneva Conventions as a genocide occurring in Xinjiang? I literally do not understand that. I've tried to think about it, understand it. I don't know, if, Rachel or Emily, if you have thoughts on how liberals and Democrats kind of square that circle. To me, it just frankly makes no sense. I have not found a compelling reason whatsoever.
Well, I think one of the things you're touching on is this like gross over intellectualization of our foreign policy. Like you have people that just beard stroke to death what is obviously what you just said. It's common sense. Like great power politics is inherently self-interested. That's what it is. And when you get into this notion of like statecraft and diplomacy, yes, there's a skill set there, but it is not like ivory tower justifications that contort themselves into pretzels and end up, justifying actions, to your point, in Libya that have no clear endpoint and make no sense. But that, this sort of ivory tower foreign policy is what has gotten us into some of the worst mistakes that America has ever made. And I think that's, again, what you're seeing here. But I think to what, Ben's very eloquently laid out sort of all these things, what infuriates me about it is that this was obvious. Like we've been doing these things for so long one way, and yet we act surprised when we reinstitute sort of this international neoliberalism, deference to international organizations, and then we get taken for a ride. This happens every time. It's like, oh, hey, when you dismantle your border controls and you tell people to come here, you get a border surge. Like these things are knowable and they have known consequences, and yet we persist. And half of the country acts surprised or pretends that these things aren't even happening when they are. So at some point, I think the case has to be made and actually litigated from rational people on the left to change the left's approach. But I think there's a very strong case for the sort of America First right to say, look, you're stepping in it again. And I think that's obviously what Ben just said. So.
And sort of another response, piggybacking on what Rachel just said, is neoliberal thinkers and leaders have not really changed their ideas about free trade. No matter what happened over the course of the Trump administration, there hasn't been a lot of movement on things like the WTO. Like this, they're still pretty much clinging to the notion that was the right decision. They don't have a lot of intellectual humility that they messed up on any of those decisions over the last couple of decades. And I think they really still do prioritize and believe in the value of trade, both monetary trade and cultural exchange. And I don't think that they've really let go or discarded with that notion or discarded with that theory, even though it's sort of been undercut over the last 2 decades in practice. I don't think that they've let go of it. And one thing I'm like weirdly lacking in pessimism today, but I would say one thing also to keep in mind is that China looks silly talking about human rights to a lot of other countries around the world, and that's a good thing from the perspective of that exchange between Blinken and China last week. So China can sort of talk about human rights, and Blinken can respond in a way that probably is a little bit more deferential or a little weaker than what Mike Pompeo, for instance, would have done. But still, there's a takeaway for a lot of other countries that's like, it's ridiculous for China to use human rights. Obviously, it's more of a tactical question to whether or not it's embarrassing for America. It's a tactical question of how we respond to that. But at least there is some increasing awareness among other parties in the geopolitical sphere that China is being ridiculous about this. But it's so interesting how they exploit all of the sort of 1619 rhetoric that comes out of the far left. And a lot of this, what bothers me about a lot of what's coming out of the left right now is it's just an intellectual plaything for the elites, right? These ideas about America's demise and America's systemic racism and patriarchy. It's an intellectual plaything. Again, when you put it into practice, it doesn't hold up. And that happened so clearly with the 1619 Project. And so this elite intellectual plaything is being exploited by our enemies to undermine us. And instead of reconsidering, sort of the practical applications of everything that they're saying, they just keep doubling down on these false narratives about the country that are being exploited by our enemies to distract from their human rights abuses that are significantly worse than anything happening in the United States of America, where people have shed blood, sweat, and tears for decades to create equality under the law, which is not always perfect in terms of equality in practice, but we have that system and we fought really hard for it. And in other countries, people are in literal concentration camps. And they continue to spin these narratives that are being exploited by our enemies without a second thought. And it's really pathetic to watch.
One last point to just highlight something Emily just said. You see this constantly in the race for AI, artificial intelligence, and dominance in this space. It's us or China, and whoever wins this war is going to dominate the world, basically. And Google is one of our cutting edge companies in this fight. And while China is actually doing the work, Google's AI department is having a woke war. Basically, like they have a diversity problem. They keep, tying themselves in knots over this woke culture. And you know who's benefiting? China. So again, to just highlight the point Emily just made with a very real anecdote.
I just want to return to your point about the Libya situation is amazing in so many respects, because this was like one of the few knock-on positive benefits from Iraq and Afghanistan was Gaddafi disarming. And then, so what do we do with the one outside victory from those engagements? We squander it by obviously empowering the Islamists in Libya by taking out Gaddafi, and it ends up with Americans dead there. Just a perfect representation of where our national security and foreign policy establishment was and is today. So beyond that, okay, why did they do the irrational thing to anyone with a brain? So I think there are a few reasons. First, there does seem to be this sort of sickness in the West where we always seek out moderates, purported moderates in the rest of the world. We want to see others like we are ourselves. And so we project onto others that even in the most evil regimes, well, there's always hardliners and moderates, rather than the fact that the nature of the regime is the nature of the regime. You should take them at their word. At least that's a prudent thing to do. It doesn't mean you go fight wars everywhere. It's obviously not in your self-interest. But it does mean that you have to, as a matter of survival, take your adversary at his word and plan accordingly. But beyond the kind of naivete aspect of this, the other sickness that I think exists among far too many Westerners, especially elites, is a perverse sense of guilt and a belief that on some level our adversaries actually are right. Like we are an immoral country at our core to some degree, and they may feel in their own lives that the positions that they've been handed were not really necessarily earned. I mean, this is psychoanalysis, but if we're speculating here, I'm going to feel free to speculate here. And there's a sort of moral narcissism, but a narcissistic self-loathing that I think pervades our elites. And that leads to these disastrous consequences when it comes to national security and foreign policy. Lastly, with respect to China, I do think that there is also legitimate fear that China really is poised to be the dominant power, which does become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy if our elites are all going to fall in line and try to get on board what they think will be a gravy train, but which in reality will lead us to be, at very best, a vassal of communist China. And they should really be asked the question, do you want your kids to grow up in a world where China is the dominant power? Even if they think it's in their self-interest to count out a communist China, is it in their self-interest for their children to essentially be subservient to the CCP? I think not, but the question hasn't been posed, and it ought to be posed to everyone who takes that sort of position.
So just to kind of continue this round of kind of our final closing thoughts here, China, what happened in South Dakota, what I was talking about with kind of Conservatism, Inc., even kind of the feminism discussion to an extent, actually. Woke capital seems to kind of pervade a lot of what we discussed today. And this is not a new topic to the show. It's something that we've discussed many times in the past year. But woke capital obviously is largely to blame, and not exclusively, that'd be overstating it, but I think is largely to blame for kind of the intense coupling with the Chinese Communist Party over the past 50 years with our arch geopolitical foe. Obviously, woke capital is primarily, if not exclusively, to blame for Kristi Noem's capitulation in South Dakota. And it probably, frankly, is to blame for a lot of kind of the intellectual sclerosis, the inertia in large swaths of Conservatism, Inc. as well. If you kind of look at kind of like a lot of like the big tech, Wall Street donor money, where that's going, it's obviously going towards more kind of liberalized, kind of libertarian leaning schools of thought that aren't necessarily what the median voter in flyover country wants to hear. So it just seems to me that no matter where we look, the problem of woke capital is kind of sticking up its very ugly head. And I just want to strongly emphasize that op-ed that I mentioned earlier that Sohrab Ahmari wrote in the New York Post in January after the January 6th riot, where he basically said the quicker that the Republican Party and the conservative movement at large can divorce itself from corporate America, the better. Because I think we see that playing over and over and over again here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, it was disappointing to me when I saw, I think it was a Bloomberg story last week, that the Republicans are now back to begging the corporate PACs to give them money again. And I think to your point, it's like, why? These corporations hate us. They hate our values. They've made this clear time and time again. It's time to build a new donor base. And I think the less we're beholden to these corporations, the more empowered people like Kristi Noem will be to say no, just to stand up for what it is that I think South Dakota voters, at least, have shown that they want. I have a friend who said, to be conservative is just to really notice the things that you're not supposed to notice. And I think that sort of is kind of pervading a lot of the conservative movement right now. We're saying, maybe we shouldn't do things, exactly the same way. What worked 30 years ago probably isn't the prescription that will necessarily work today. Or, our foreign policy has been, completely bastardized, into supporting a communist country as if it's in our self-interest. And, the ability to call these things out. And I think even in the response to Kristi Noem, you have a conservative movement that for a long time was being patted on the head with regard to social and religious issues. I've been very critical of the pro-life movement for accepting these head pats as actual, substance. And I think you're starting to see a lot of conservatives say, no, Governor Noem, this petition is not action, and we won't actually be blinded by this hamster wheel to think you're doing something when you're not. So I am encouraged in that regard, and I'm happy to be hopefully participating, in helping people notice more of those things.
I swear I'm not purposefully trying to be optimistic today, but I think it's because it's spring and it's like warm in DC in the sun. I'm bathing in the sun from my window, but there's something. When I was in college, we were talking about Occupy Wall Street, and the conservative movement was focused on this intense belief that the Tea Party was about limited government in the sense that conservatives had always discussed it. And it seemed as though there was this populist response, finally, to conservative free market dogma. It was as though everybody had suddenly read Hayek, and they were animated to march on Washington. And that was never really the case. But when I was in college, we were talking about the 1% versus the 99%. We were talking about how sometimes actually corporations provide jobs, which provide strong culture, et cetera, et cetera. We were having those conversations. Towards the end of my time in college, which was, I think I graduated from college 6 years ago now, all we were talking about was gender. All we were talking about was cultural issues. And then again, I do tons of work with college students and students in general, and all I hear from them now, they don't talk about economics on campus. They talk about the cultural issues. And so I think the positive part of this is the young conservative movement is extremely ready to take on the cultural issues. And they are, because of the one sort of like, you can say, when you're balancing sort of the pros and cons of the Trump era, one incredible pro is that they are not ready to accept half victories. They will not concede these sort of exactly what Rachel said, these petitions as progress, there's just no appetite for that, I think, anymore, and particularly on the cultural issues. And if obviously culture and economics are entangled, but when you read things like Tim Carney's book or Mary Eberstadt's book, culture is really at the heart of so much of this. So until we can take care of that, we can't make any progress on the economic issues. And so I'm glad that I think the energy is, the momentum is on the right side in the conservative movement right now. I think the Kristi Noem case study is an example of that. And so continuing to fight the corporate interests that, tempt people like Kristi Noem with jobs when they're going to embarrass the state and hurt women. I'm optimistic that people like Kristi Noem are going to face the pressures that set different standards for Republicans going forward.
On Emily's, go on, Ben.
Just really briefly, just a coda to my last point in that foreign policy segment that sort of ties a bow on all of this. It is really instructive to look at how our ruling class, as we've often referred to it here, treats the Chinese Communist Party versus its hostility towards American conservatives. And I think that demonstrates something that we've seen over the last few years, which is that as all of our institutions sort of self-immolate, and they also expose themselves for their hatred for American conservatives. And so it becomes blindingly obvious, I think, what the stakes are and where the battle lines are being drawn. And as a consequence of that, hopefully some people who are wobbly will see that they ought to stand with their constituents. But more broadly, it's never been more clear, I think, where those divides are. And that's a very positive thing and a necessary thing if we're ultimately going to succeed and thrive and actually put forth ideas that work for the half of the country that still has that common sense that, as Josh, you've spoken to, is so lacking among so many among our benighted betters.
I think that's well said. The battle lines, even within conservative world, are increasingly hardening. They're increasingly being established. And we're doing our best to present you one or sometimes more than one perspective every single week on the issues that matter to you. So we are out of time here, but on behalf of Rachel Bovard, Emily Jashinsky, and Ben Weingarten, I'm Josh Hammer. We will see you at the next NatCon Squad.